The room seemed to hum with potential, its stillness broken only by the faint buzz of the equipment Neil had carefully arranged. The large speakers stood like looming monoliths in the dim light, the tangle of wires snaking across the floor, a testament to the precision and effort that had gone into preparing this moment. The very air felt heavy, charged with an almost electric anticipation. Outside, the world had grown unnaturally silent, as though nature itself had paused to bear witness. Neil and ZAK stood in the center of the room, their instruments slung over their shoulders like ancient relics prepared for battle. The weight of the moment pressed on both of them, and though neither spoke, their shared glances conveyed everything. Neil's breaths came shallow and quick, his fingers trembling as he adjusted one of the dials on the amp. The vibrations in his chest weren't from the equipment. It was the rush of blood coursing through his body, carrying with it an undeniable mixture of fear and resolve. To summon Corneilus, their creation had to be irresistible, a call so dark and all-encompassing that the entity could not resist. Neil had been here before, balancing on the edge of something incomprehensible, and the memory had clung to him ever since. He knew what it took to reach that place, what had fueled him in the past. The mushrooms. Right or wrong, he had given in. An hour ago, he had consumed a handful, and now their effects were crawling through his veins. His skin prickled, every nerve alive and buzzing with hypersensitivity. The room seemed both too small and impossibly vast, its edges blurring in his heightened perception. Neil turned to ZAK, his gaze cutting through the haze. ZAK met his father's eyes for a moment, before quickly looking away. There was something cold in Neil's stare, something unshakable that unnerved ZAK despite his own steady resolve. Neil reached out, his movements precise but deliberate, flicking a switch. The low hum of the equipment sprang to life, vibrating through the floorboards and into their bones. ZAK shifted his stance, his fingers tightening instinctively on the neck of his instrument. The silence that followed was not empty. It was oppressive, a moment stretched impossibly thin as the room held its breath. Neil's hand hovered over a button, his fingers trembling slightly. This was the threshold, the moment before the plunge. The raw anticipation in the room was a living thing, and outside, the wind seemed to grow still, as though the world itself had paused in preparation. All that remained was the inevitable pull of the first note, the moment they would cross the line and step fully into the darkness. The room quivered with anticipation as the first pounding notes broke through the stillness. It was a sound unlike any other, a deep, relentless rhythm, like the hooves of 100 horses in a frenzied gallop. The vibrations ricocheted off the walls, rippling through the air and into the bones of everyone present. And then, without warning, it stopped. Silence fell, sharp and sudden, as if the very fabric of time had been sliced clean through. For a moment, it seemed the world itself held its breath. And then, in perfect, synchronized motion, Neil, ZAK, and the thunderous roar of the sound began again. The intricate rhythms churned on, grinding like an ancient millstone, each note heavy and grinding, dragging them deeper into the abyss. Neil and ZAK's heads moved in unison, their bodies swayed with the hypnotic pull of the biting, repetitive sound. The room was a storm, and they were the eye of it, lost in the chaos they had summoned. Jacob stood to the side, his sharp gaze darting between Neil and ZAK. His jaw tightened, concern etched into the lines of his face. He turned toward Edmund, a silent question flashing in his eyes. But Edmund merely shook his head. He could feel it too, the pull of the music, the way it wrapped itself around the two like a dark, smothering fog. They were no longer just playing. They were conduits, channeling something far beyond themselves. And then, ZAKS stepped forward. His foot slammed down on the button that lay at his feet, and the room erupted. His fingers blurred as they flew across the strings of the strange, many-stringed instrument, each note piercing through the cacophony like shards of light cutting through shadow. The melodic patterns bled into the chaos, weaving threads of something otherworldly into the relentless rhythm. Neil's hands moved instinctively, his fingers twisting dials and hammering strings, his body a vessel for the dark energy that coursed through the room. He hadn't looked up, not once. His eyes remained firmly closed, his head bowed as though in some strange, profane reverence. And then, as if compelled by the weight of what he felt, he opened them. The world shifted. The edges of the room shimmered and bent, folding in on themselves like waves of heat rising from scorched earth. The walls seemed to ripple, their solidity dissolving into something transient and unreal. Neil could feel him, Corneilus. He was there, just beyond the veil, his presence thick and suffocating, the air heavy with the stench of decay. It clawed at Neil's senses, his stomach turning as the rancid smell of Cornelius's breath filled the room, overwhelming and inescapable. Neil's body moved of its own accord, his hand slamming harder on the strings, his entire being consumed by the rhythm. The mushrooms coursing through his veins sent his senses spiraling, amplifying the sound, the smell, the sheer weight of what was coming. Without even the influence of the mushrooms, ZAKS had fallen into the same trance, his face a mask of focused intensity. There was no need for words. They both knew what had to be done. The dark miasma of sound had to remain unbroken, relentless, flowing like a river of shadow into the abyss. And they did. The room writhed under the weight of the noise, a living, breathing entity of chaos. And somewhere in the void, Cornelius began to stir. In the fathomless void of another dimension, Cornelius stirred. His eyes, faint pinpricks of light in the oppressive darkness, flickered once, then again, before igniting with a sickly glow. The black pupils, no larger than grains of sand, began to expand, consuming the yellow sclera until they became vast, bottomless wells of darkness. He floated there, suspended like an embryo in a viscous, malevolent plasma, his long, spindly fingers twitching and weaving as though conducting some unseen symphony of dread. His lidless, jaundiced eyes darted wildly, scanning the void with a frantic urgency. Then, in the distance, a faint light emerged, a pinprick of brilliance piercing the endless black. Cornelius froze, his lipless mouth curling back into a grotesque grimace that exposed rows of needle-like teeth, each one glistening with thick black saliva that dripped and pooled in the void around him. The sight of the light seemed to ignite something within him, a primal hunger that made his entire form quiver. His pupils, once vast and consuming, began to contract, focusing with laser precision on the source of the light. Tendrils of energy began to radiate from the point of light, thin and delicate at first, like strands of spider silk drifting on an unseen breeze. The currents of the otherworldly dimension carried them toward him, their movement slow but deliberate. When the first tendril touched him, Cornelius convulsed, his body locking in a grotesque spasm. He groaned, the sound guttural and raw, as though dragged from the depths of his being. The energy coursed through him, lighting up his form with an eerie, pulsating glow. At first, his expression twisted into something resembling pleasure, his grotesque features contorting as the sound reached his receptors. But the pleasure was fleeting. His face darkened, his grimace shifting into a snarl of pure rage.
"Pain,"
he hissed, the word dripping with venom.
"Pain for those who defy me."
His voice rose, a guttural scream that reverberated through the void, oscillating toward the light with a force that seemed to shake the very fabric of the dimension.
"Pain,"
he roared, the sound tearing through the darkness like a blade. The light pulsed in response, its intensity growing as it fed on the sound. Cornelius's cries, filled with fury and anguish, seemed to fuel his strength, giving him the power to push against the boundaries of his prison. The tendrils of energy wrapped around him, pulling him toward the light, toward the sound, toward the corporeal world that awaited his arrival. The air in Neil's shack was thick with tension, pressing down like an invisible weight. Shadows danced erratically on the walls, distorted by the rhythmic pulsations of the sound emanating from the instruments. Neil and ZAKS stood at the center of it all, bodies drenched in sweat as they worked tirelessly to sustain the dark resonance. The music they wove was relentless, a heavy, sinking force that dragged everything into its depths. "Keep it tight," Neil shouted over the discord, his voice strained but commanding. ZAK's head snapped up, nodding in acknowledgement before his focus returned to the hypnotic rhythm. The room seemed to vibrate with the music's energy, its pitch so low that the actual notes dissolved into a hum that could barely be discerned, yet was felt deep within the bones. It created the sensation of falling, an endless descent through an abyss where light could not reach. The repetitive sound was mesmerizing, and Neil and ZAK swayed in unison, their movements stiff and mechanical, pulled into the grip of the trance they had conjured. To the side, Jacob and Edmund exchanged a look of alarm. The effect of the music was undeniable. The very fabric of time and space seemed to warp around them, fraying like threads, unraveling from an ancient tapestry. The room grew colder still, the chill creeping along the floor like a living entity. Yet Neil and ZAK sweated profusely, their exertion and the mental toll visible on their faces and trembling hands. Neil's mind spiraled under the influence of the psilocybin coursing through his veins. His perception bent and twisted, sharpening and dissolving in equal measure. Flashes of grotesque images broke through his thoughts, brains torn apart, blood pooling in unseen corners, the raw essence of fear and helplessness. The visions clawed at his resolve, but Neil gritted his teeth and forced them away, locking his focus onto the relentless rhythm. "The music," he muttered to himself. "It's the music." Through the haze, Neil felt Cornelius inching closer from the other realm. He could feel the creature's struggle, a twisted dance between the pull of their sound and the resistance of the barrier between dimensions. Cornelius wavered, fighting against the unnatural summons that sought to drag him into their world. And then Neil faltered. His rhythm broke as his hands stuttered across the strings, sending a jarring ripple through the room. Heads snapped toward him. ZAK, Jacob, Edmund, all with expressions of surprise and unease. But Neil's gaze was locked onto Ed. With a sharp motion, he gestured toward the 9-stringed instrument, his intent clear. Ed hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, his hand brushing against the strings. Neil's instincts were sharp despite the trance. He knew Cornelius's resistance required more. The monster hovered on the precipice, struggling to breach the barrier between realms. Edmund's contribution was the final key, the last piece needed to tilt the balance and pull Cornelius into their dimension. Neil's teeth clenched as he returned to the rhythm, pouring every ounce of strength into keeping the dark, biting sound consistent. He glanced at Edmund again, and as their eyes met, A flicker of understanding passed between them. With Ed's hands poised over the instrument, Neil knew they were on the brink of something unstoppable. The device sprang to life, its potential buzzing faintly beneath his hands. But Ed didn't rush. He stood still, his breathing slow and steady as he attuned himself to the soundscape around him. He watched Neil and ZAK intently, his sharp mind deciphering the intricate patterns they wove together, like threads in a tapestry of dissonance. His fingers twitched in anticipation, but he didn't yet play. Instead, he waited, listening deeply, his mind syncing with theirs. The rhythm was jagged, yet purposeful, and he began to feel the pulse of it, letting it guide him. Sweat slicked his brow as the tension mounted, the room seeming to stretch and contract with the weight of the sound. Time felt elastic, each second an eternity as he prepared to join. Then, with perfect timing, Ed struck. The moment his fingers touched the strings, the room seemed to shudder, the sound exploding like a new force born from the collision of their three energies. His playing was fluid and masterful, blending seamlessly into the chaos, yet adding a dimension of complexity that hadn't existed before. It was as though the music had found its missing piece, the rhythm sharpening into something even more alive, more relentless, and more consuming. Ed's melodies carved through the soundscape, cutting through the guttural weight with a sharp, otherworldly clarity. The 9 strings sang under his command, their tones weaving through the noise like threads of silver through a storm of black. Neil and ZAK instinctively adjusted, their playing shifting to accommodate and amplify Ed's contribution. The three of them now moved as one, their music a living, breathing entity, unified in its purpose. The room seemed to quake under the sound's intensity. Edmund could feel the pull of it, the way it strained at the boundaries of reality, tearing at the veil between dimensions. His fingers moved faster, finding notes he didn't consciously seek, his connection to the instrument almost supernatural. Through the haze, Jacob watched in awe, his unease replaced by a grudging sense of reverence. The shift in the music was palpable, a crackling energy that filled the room and expanded outward, as though reaching beyond the physical plane. And as Ed's playing fused with the sound, Cornelius stirred again. Closer, stronger, and more determined than ever. The shack shuddered violently as a deafening boom tore through the air, an explosion so sudden and absolute that the room was momentarily sucked into a vacuum. Time seemed to stop, the breath of the world stolen away. Then, with brutal force, everything rebounded, sending a shockwave that rippled through the walls and floorboards. The three men reeled, their bodies jolted by the sheer impact. Yet they held firm, clinging to the rhythm that bound them to this dark, malevolent ritual. They were passengers now, hurtling forward on a hypnotic horse of evil, galloping full speed toward the abyss. Neil, lost in his altered state, felt the shift deep within his being. Through the haze of psilocybin and sound, he sensed the boundaries between dimensions tearing apart, the veil growing thinner with each pulsating note. Images flashed across his mind in rapid succession, their grotesque intensity threatening to overwhelm him. Visions of endless darkness, twisting shadows, and the creeping presence of something far beyond his control. ZAK played beside him, his fingers moving instinctively, mechanical and precise, their movements powered by the unrelenting trance that enveloped them. Edmund's 9-stringed contribution added layers of complexity to the cacophony, the soundscape brimming with energy and chaos that seemed to press against the very edges of reality. Neil's breathing quickened, his sweat-soaked body trembling as he continued to play. His gaze flicked up, and for the first time, he saw it. The shimmering distortion in the air, the bending and twisting of space as Corneilus pushed forward, clawing his way through the dimensions. The room grew colder, the chill sharp enough to cut through the oppressive heat radiating from their exertion. Neil's senses sharpened, his altered perception magnifying every detail. Corneilus was advancing, each flicker, each ripple in the air signaling his imminent arrival. Neil's heart raced as he caught glimpses of him in the distortion. Elongated fingers reaching, lidless eyes darting, a skeletal grin flashing from his grimacing, lipless mouth. The stench of decay hung heavy in the room, an unholy presence that clung to every surface. Neil's hands moved faster, his playing becoming more frantic as the weight of Cornelius's presence grew. He glanced briefly at Zak and Ed, their faces strained yet resolute, their bodies tethered to the music's relentless flow. This wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a weapon, a summoning that could not be undone. And there he was, Corneilus, just moments from stepping fully into Neil's simple home, bringing with him the darkness that had been lurking at the edge of their world. Neil could feel it in his bones, in the trembling strings beneath his fingers. The descent had reached its breaking point. The darkness thickened, coalescing into a swirling mass that pulsed with malevolent energy. The thin tendrils that had crept out now writhed and twisted, snaking along the floor and licking at the edges of the room like sentient shadows. The air hung heavy with an oppressive chill, every breath shallow and tinged with the sickly, stale scent of decay. At the center of the maelstrom, a figure began to take shape. Cornelius's form emerged slowly, each detail seeping into existence like ink bleeding across water. His towering silhouette grew distinct against the churning void, his elongated limbs stretching unnaturally, grotesque yet undeniably commanding. His skin was ashen, mottled with dark, vein-like patterns that pulsed faintly with the same eerie rhythm as the shadows around him. His long fingers twitched restlessly, their razor-sharp tips gleaming as if thirsting for flesh. As his head rose, the putrid yellow orbs of his eyes scanned the room with a terrifying intensity. The black pupils were bottomless voids that seemed to draw the light from the room, leaving nothing but despair in their wake. His gaze swept over the occupants, lingering on each with a distinct sense of contempt. It was not merely disdain. It was the gaze of a being so far removed from humanity that their existence was nothing more than an irritant, an obstacle beneath notice, yet infuriating in its audacity to defy him. His quivering mouth curled into a grotesque sneer, exposing rows of needle-like teeth that dripped with the thick, black ichor of some unspeakable hunger. When he spoke, it was not with words, but with a deep, guttural growl that reverberated through the room, shaking the very foundations of the shack. It was as though the sound came from the core of existence itself, bypassing the ears and settling directly in the minds of those who heard it. Neil and Zak, still locked in their trance, remained at the center of the chaos, their hands moving feverishly over their instruments. The dark rhythm continued to resonate, a defiant pulse that refused to bow to the entity now standing before them. Their sweat-soaked faces glistened in the dim, flickering light, their exhaustion visible but their resolve unwavering. Jake stood firm within his circle, his jaw clenched as he gripped the relics of his craft. Ed, having fled to his own circle, was equally focused, his hands trembling but ready. Both men watched in tense silence, their spells prepared but their unease mounting. Cornelius's gaze swept over them last, and as it did, the faint flicker of disdain in his expression darkened into something cruel, mockery, as though he could sense their preparations and already dismissed them as futile. Cornelius's presence filled the room, every shadow trembling in his wake. The sound of Neil and ZAKS' unholy rhythm reverberated around him, clashing against his essence. Yet he remained unyielding. His towering form shifted slightly, his limbs bending unnaturally as he took a single step forward. His jagged teeth parted, and a low, bone-chilling hiss escaped him, as though daring them to proceed further, daring them to challenge his dominance. The room vibrated with unseen forces, the air thick with the energy of ancient incantations spilling from Jake and Ed's circles. Their movements were precise, their voices steady as they recited the spells drawn from the Book of Secrets, the grimoire of Albertus Magnus. Though there were no dramatic gestures, the raw power behind their chants rippled through the atmosphere, sparking faint flashes along the edges of their circles. The containment spells they cast began to weave themselves into the fabric of the room, forming barriers that pressed against Cornelius's encroaching darkness. Cornelius recoiled, his towering form twisting violently as he registered the growing resistance. His lipless mouth pulled back into a grotesque sneer, exposing the glistening needles of his teeth. Then his gaze snapped toward Jacob and Edmund with terrifying intensity. His lidless, jaundiced eyes widened as his pupils expanded, growing deeper, darker, until they seemed bottomless, as though each man's soul might fall into the abyss within them. The force of his gaze was overwhelming, his powers coiling outward like tendrils of persuasion, peeling away at the fragile defenses surrounding Jake and Ed. The tendrils slithered through the air, wrapping themselves around the edges of their circles and prying at their minds. Even with their eyes tightly shut, both men felt the pull, an inexorable tug at their consciousness, a dark whisper that gnawed at their resolve. The barriers faltered, cracks forming as Cornelius's influence seeped in, pressing against them like an invading tide. Slowly, as though compelled by some invisible force, Jacob and Edmund opened their eyes. Their gazes locked onto Cornelius, his malevolence drawing them in like moths to a flame. He stood in the center of the room, his form pulsating with darkness, the faint glimmers of their spells barely holding him at bay. His expression shifted into something cruel, triumphant, until a blinding explosion of light erupted from the far side of the room. The brightness tore through the oppressive gloom, cutting through Cornelius's influence like a blade of pure energy. His grotesque sneer vanished in an instant, replaced by a look of shock as the radiant force slammed into him. He staggered backward, his massive form convulsing as the light burned through the tendrils he had cast. It wasn't just light, it was something far more powerful, an essence so pure it seemed to defy the laws of his dimension. Zak had removed the strange instrument from his shoulders, setting it aside as he knelt before a wall of twinkling lights and keyboards. The array glimmered faintly, casting soft, shifting hues across his face, which was slick with sweat and marked with determination. His fingers hovered over the controls, trembling slightly before finally pressing a button. The room was instantly filled with the sound of a flowing sequence of notes, crystalline and ethereal, each one a droplet of purity in the storm of chaos that surrounded them. Cornelius froze mid-assault. His grotesque form contorted violently as the sound reached him, his lipless mouth pulling back into a snarl that exposed rows of jagged teeth. His yellow, lidless eyes narrowed into slits, his pupils dilating with pure loathing as he swung his gaze toward Zak. The music struck him like a wave of light, pure and unrelenting, each note tearing through the oppressive darkness that radiated from his form. Zak's hands moved with purpose, twisting dials and adjusting settings as the ethereal melody grew richer, more vibrant. With each adjustment, the sound gained new layers of beauty, like threads of sunlight weaving their way into the tapestry of chaos. The shimmering notes pulsed outward, radiant waves of light that seemed to push back the encroaching shadows. Cornelius roared, his guttural cry filling the room as he lashed out, his elongated fingers clawing at the air in futile rage. For a moment, Zak faltered, his hands stilled for a heartbeat, the rhythm wavering as a flicker of doubt crossed his face. Cornelius seized the opportunity, his twisted form lunging toward the boundary that separated him from the mortal realm. His movements were feral, thrashing and writhing like a beast cornered, yet relentless. But Zak's hesitation lasted only a second. He closed his eyes, exhaled, and surrendered himself fully to the music. His hands moved again, fluid and precise, as he became one with the ethereal overture, a vessel for the light. The effect was immediate. The waves of sound grew stronger, brighter, pushing Cornelius back with each pulsation. The room seemed to shimmer with the intensity of the battle, light and dark clashing in a cosmic struggle for dominance. Above Charnwood, storm clouds gathered, their swirling masses mirroring the chaos below. The wind picked up, sharp and biting, carrying with it the scent of rain and earth. Outside, Ken stood at his post near the entrance of Charnwood, his heavy coat pulled tightly around him. The chill wind whipped at his face, his warm breath forming fleeting clouds in the night air. He was no stranger to the strange occurrences that came with Samhain, but even he could feel the unique magnitude of what was unfolding tonight. The ground beneath his boots seemed to tremble faintly, a subtle echo of the turmoil within Neil's shack. Ken shivered, though not from the cold, and whispered a quiet prayer. A prayer to no one in particular, an instinctive plea born of hope and desperation. He was not a believer, but tonight, it seemed, even skeptics found faith in the unknown. The energy surrounding Neil's shack was palpable, a distortion in the air that shimmered and rippled as though reality itself was fraying at the edges. Outside, the swirling clouds above Charnwood churned with malevolent force, casting unnatural shadows that danced and writhed like living entities. The very molecules of the air seemed to tremble under Cornelius's unrelenting rage, his presence warping the environment with every pulsation of his dark essence. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The walls groaned faintly, and the flickering light from ZAKS station fought valiantly against the encroaching shadows. Neil was on his knees, his once steely resolve broken. His body trembled, his hands clasped together as he begged for his soul, his voice cracking with despair. He was a man on the brink, caught between the crushing weight of guilt and the overwhelming dread of Cornelius's presence. Zak, in stark contrast, sat steadfast at his station, surrounded by a wall of twinkling lights and keyboards that pulsed with energy. His hands moved with methodical precision, manipulating controls that sent waves of shimmering particles into the air. The radiant energy left no shadows to hide in, each beam cutting through the oppressive darkness with relentless fervor. Yet ZAKS' determination was not without cost. His face was pale and drawn, his body trembling with the exertion of maintaining the ethereal overture. In the center of the room loomed Corneilus, a towering monstrosity that seemed to embody the very essence of terror. His elongated form swayed unnaturally, his skeletal frame outlined by the flickering light. His jaundiced, lidless eyes pierced the room with malevolent intent, their gaze like twin blades that cut into the minds of all who dared meet them. His long, skeletal fingers twitched incessantly, their razor-sharp tips gleaming with a sinister hunger. But it was not just his grotesque appearance. It was the aura of putrid, radiating evil that seeped from him, saturating the air with an almost tangible malice. He was a nightmare made flesh, and his presence was a wound upon the very fabric of reality. Ed sat transfixed, his eyes locked on the entity. His mouth hung slightly open, a mixture of awe and terror paralyzing him as he struggled to process the full horror of Cornelius's form. The radiance of the 9-stringed instrument lay dormant for now, its power rendered momentarily insignificant in the face of the abomination before them. It took every ounce of Ed's willpower to tear his gaze away, his head snapping toward Jake as though seeking reassurance. Jake sat within his meticulously drawn circle, his posture rigid with concentration. His eyes were closed, his lips moving silently as he mouthed the ancient words of magic. The grimoire of Albertus Magnus lay open before him, its pages glowing faintly with the resonance of his ritual. Beads of sweat ran down his temples, his face a mask of focus and resolve. The power he channeled was fragile, yet potent, a spark of hope against the overwhelming tide of darkness. Cornelius's head tilted slightly, his yellow orbs narrowing as he became aware of Jake's defiance. A low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within his chest, his twisted mouth curling into a sneer as he extended a hand toward Jake's circle. The air crackled with unseen energy as his long fingers twitched, dark tendrils of persuasion slithering forward to pry at Jake's barriers. But he did not falter. His words grew louder, stronger, as though invoking a force greater than himself. The air in the room seemed to still for a moment, the opposing energies locked in a deadly equilibrium. And then, with a faint shudder, Jacob's circle began to glow brighter, a faint warmth spreading outward. He was calling upon something beyond spells, beyond magic, an invocation to Jean, her essence lingering in the objects and memories that remained. The shack trembled as the balance shifted, the battle poised on the edge of salvation or ruin. Jake knelt within his glowing circle, the objects from June's farmhouse arranged with meticulous care around him. The woolen hat, the pair of spectacles, simple items, yet imbued with the essence of her life, her love, and her unwavering strength. He closed his eyes, steadying his breathing as the ancient incantation began to take form on his lips. His voice was low and deliberate, each word resonating in the charged air. The power of his focus radiated outward, weaving tendrils of energy that began to hum and spark faintly, intertwining with the oppressive darkness that filled the room. The tension in the shack was nearly unbearable, the weight of Cornelius's malevolence pressing down like a crushing tide. Neil remained on his knees, trembling and begging for his soul, while Zak continued his work, sending cascading waves of light and music into the storm of chaos. Ed stood frozen, his wide eyes locked on Cornelius, the dark entity towering in the center of the room, thrashing and clawing against their resistance. Then, Slowly, something began to shift. The objects in Jacob's circle started to glow softly, their light faint but growing with each syllable of his chant. A warmth spread through the cold, stale air, pushing back the chill of Cornelius's presence. The woolen hat lifted slightly from the floor, floating as though cradled by unseen hands, while the spectacles shimmered, their lenses refracting the growing light into gentle arcs that reached every corner of the room. Jake's voice grew stronger, his words filling the space with an undeniable force. The glow intensified, the light pulsing with the rhythm of his chant, until it became almost blinding. And then, with a sound like the softest sigh, she appeared. Jean's form materialized within the light, her presence radiant and serene. She stood tall and graceful, her silver hair framing a face that exuded kindness and an unyielding strength. Her eyes, warm and piercing, swept across the room, taking in the chaos before settling on Neil. The love in her gaze was visible, wrapping around him like a protective embrace, lifting him from his despair. Neil's trembling stilled as he looked up, his tear-streaked face filled with awe and disbelief. "Mother," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Jean did not speak. She moved with quiet purpose, her every step filled with the weight of maternal determination. Her light grew brighter with each moment, its purity carving through Cornelius's darkness like a blade. Cornelius recoiled, his monstrous form writhing and twisting as he snarled in defiance. His yellow eyes burned with fury as he lashed out, sending tendrils of his energy toward her. But they dissolved upon contact with her radiance, reduced to nothingness. She raised a hand, her fingers delicate yet commanding, and the light around her expanded. It wrapped around Cornelius, enveloping him in a cocoon of brilliance that stripped away his malice and power layer by layer. His roars of agony reverberated through the room, each one weaker than the last, as he was reduced to an insignificant speck, his presence diminished to nothing more than a faint shadow. Jake's voice rose to a crescendo, his final incantation echoing as he directed the remaining fragments of Cornelius's essence into the amulet. The artifact glowed fiercely, vibrating as it absorbed the last vestiges of the darkness. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifted, leaving only the lingering warmth of Jean's presence. She turned to Neil one last time, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Her lips curved into a gentle smile before her form began to fade, the light softening until it was no more. The shack, now quiet and still, was left bathed in the faint glow of the objects she had touched, a reminder of the love that had saved them all. The night was still, its eerie quiet broken only by the soft crunch of footsteps on damp earth as Neil, Zak, Jake, and Ed carried the glowing amulet across the plot. The artifact pulsed faintly within its carved wooden box, its light spilling through the cracks like faint ribbons of flame. Jake had painstakingly lined the box with scrolls of spells, ancient and potent, their inscriptions imbued with protective power to keep the darkness forever hidden. The box itself felt heavy, not from its physical weight, but from the gravity of what it contained. The far end of Charnwood lay in shadow, tucked away beneath the canopy of twisted, gnarled branches. It was a secluded spot, intentionally chosen by Neil and Zak earlier that day, where the soil was rich and deep enough to swallow the weight of the past. The scrub had been cleared, the hole dug with precision and purpose, its depths now waiting to receive the artifact and the burden that came with it. The group stood in solemn silence as Jake knelt by the edge of the hole. He placed the box within, its glow dimming slightly as it nestled into the earth. For a moment, Jake hesitated, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the box, his thoughts flickering over the chaos they had endured. Then, with steady resolve, he began his final incantation. His voice was low but clear, each word resonating in the night air, weaving a spell of containment that would seal the amulet's dark energy away forever. The ground seemed to vibrate faintly as the spell took hold, the edges of the hole glowing softly before fading into darkness. Jake rose slowly, his face pale but composed. With a nod, Neil and Zak began to fill the hole, their movements careful and deliberate, as they worked to erase all trace of the amulet's presence. Each shovel of earth was heavier than the last, the weight of their exhaustion settling in their limbs. When the last mound of dirt was smoothed over, they lingered for a moment, their breaths misting in the chill air. The plot was quiet again, the darkness broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Without a word, the group turned and began their slow journey back to the shack, their steps dragging with fatigue. Inside, the warmth of the shack felt almost foreign after the cold outside. Neil collapsed into a chair, his head resting against the back as he stared blankly at the ceiling. Zak leaned against the wall, his hands limp at his sides, while Jake sank onto the worn floor, his legs refusing to hold him any longer. Ed slumped into a corner, his body curling inward as his eyes drifted shut. The door creaked open, and old Ken shuffled in, his coat pulled tightly around him. He muttered complaints about the bitter cold and the long night, his words barely audible as he rubbed his hands together for warmth. "What I need now," he grumbled, "is a stiff drink to chase off this frost." He glanced around at the men, his face crinkling in vague irritation. The others exchanged weary looks, too drained to laugh or even respond. In the quiet of the shack, their exhaustion hung heavy, but there was also a faint, unspoken relief, a sense that the darkness had finally been put to rest.